Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Lutke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Lutke, and today I want to continue our exploration of the Morgan affair. So again, this is an attempt to tear apart what's going on in the Morgan affair, make a dry history that's usually a couple of thousand words on a website into a relatable narrative. And in doing so, over a 6-part series, we're looking at 4 different perspectives. That of William Morgan, which we looked at last time. Today, David C. Miller, the printer. Next time, Samuel Green. Followed by the Lodge, the Masons, and what they're seeing, what they're doing. And this is a way to explore each individual character, allowing us to explore motivation and justification. So today we're going to focus on David C. Miller and the events of his life up until and a little bit after Morgan's disappearance. Miller is Morgan's publisher. And this is a way to explore Miller's experience, his role as an individual character, allowing us to look at motivations, justifications, allowing us to at least cognitively empathize, in other words, understand at a purely intellectual level where he's coming from. For reasons of time, some events may be left out if they are not directly related to the Morgan affair, or due to time constraints, because of course this is a podcast and we only have so much time to work with. Now, I've gone over sources in the past. There will be additional sources that we see through these episodes, which I will mention. The big one being Stephen Defoe's Morgan, the Scandal That Shook Freemasonry, which is unfortunately currently out of print. But as always, I owe a debt of gratitude to worshipful brother Pat Choka for loaning me his copy. That being said, let's get into the material, because I want to start to humanize and round out these people so that they move from characters in a melodrama to men that are acting based on motives and ideals. And as always, I want to remind you that men, people in general, are neither good nor evil. There's always that line of good and evil that runs through the hearts of men, and is often a question of perspective. Are the Jedi evil? Or is everyone else evil? It depends on what you see. So, let's look at Miller. In terms of background, he takes his entered apprentice in Albany, New York in 1806, and there's a story behind this. So while living in Saratoga, outside of Albany, the local Masons learned that Miller is going to republish a Masonic expose, the 1762 Boaz and Jachin, and they felt that initiation would halt the publication, this according to Defoe. So what they're trying to do is basically go, hey, he's going to publish this. Instead of doing something crazy like these people 20 years later will do, possibly, what we're going to do is we're simply going to initiate him. And once he's initiated, he can't possibly publish because he's got to follow that obligation. Yeah, there's some problems in that logic, but bear with us here. So Miller stops his degrees after the entered apprentice, and this matched the description written in Morgan's book later on, which of course does get published. The Masons say that he was not a suitable candidate to proceed. Shocking considering why they brought him in. But there's also the idea that Miller may have been the one to walk away because he's simply disenfranchised with the whole thing. He knows too much, or he sees it in the wrong light, or whatever else. And so somehow they part, and these stories differ. And anytime you see a story differ, again, it's a matter of perspective. Miller's not going to say, hey, they didn't think I was good enough, and the Lodge isn't going to say, hey, you know, he looked at us and decided that we just didn't hit the brief. So You can imagine we're going to have some mismatch there. He is the publisher of the Batavia Republican Advocate. He was a village trustee. He serves during the War of 1812, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. And we know that he does in fact serve. This is not the same as Morgan, where we're not entirely sure if he served, where he served, what he did. So until 1819, he's the only paper in town. Things are going really well for Miller. In that year, Orrin Follett launches the Spirit of the Times, and the Follett family is tied to the lodge, to the Batavia Lodge. And he had a lot in common with Morgan coming into the story. Miller and Morgan had reasons to dislike the Batavia Masons, especially by the spring and summer of 1826, just before the disappearance, because they both feel that they've been wronged by these people. So in Miller's case, well, in both cases, they frequent the village inns and the taverns. Miller, who started in Batavia as a respected businessman, had slid down the slope of life, and he may have hoped that publishing Morgan's transcript would change his financial fortunes. For Morgan, the opportunity would fill the void Masonic charity and the occasional day's labor had previously filled. So this may be a publishing trust formed out of mutual need. Morgan needs money, Miller needs money for different reasons. Miller's paper isn't doing that well. Morgan is down on his luck, but they kind of find each other. So in 1811, Miller establishes the Republican Advocate. After a fire in 1821 that burns a large part of Batavia, this is not just his press, Miller faced another paper with Masonic backing, not just Orrin Follett's The Spirit of the Times, but now we have the People's Press beginning in 1825. This leads to Miller losing more advertisers. And he blames the Masons for the loss of business. Both, from his perspective, both papers have Masonic backing. And he thinks that there's some underhanded movement. And you could imagine from an outside perspective, you look in and you go, wow, both of them are tied to the lodge. The lodge must be against me. Leaving aside the perspective that two people tied to the lodge may have just wanted to start papers for various reasons, taking on different perspectives. It's not unusual at the time for a smallish town to have 2 or 3 newspapers. One might be a socialist paper, one might be a unionist paper, one might be more of a conservative paper. They serve different audiences. And there would be one that would stand above the rest, oftentimes the one that carries all the legal decrees, the one that is the paper of record. But that is not what is going on here. We're simply seeing different perspectives. So by 1822-23, we're coming up to a few years before the disappearance. Miller meets Morgan in a tap room. In a drunken stupor, Morgan confides to Miller that he's a master mason. Well, this is not shocking. There could have been a story. Miller goes, oh yeah, the Masons, the idea of masonry comes up. Maybe they see someone who's a Mason walk in. Miller goes, oh yeah, I was, initiated, but I never went any further. And Morgan goes, well, I'm a master mason. Of course, Morgan's using that for another purpose, as we dealt with in the last episode. Miller may well have replied that he had been initiated and had entered apprentice in a lodge in Albany, but had gone no further. Whether he said or not that he'd been rejected by the lodge at Batavia, which he had tried to petition earlier, well, we're not sure, but he does try and petition the lodge at Batavia. So by 1826, now we're 6 months before the disappearance, Miller, in March of 1826, signs an agreement with Morgan. Quote, we, and each of us, do hereby most solemnly and sincerely promise and swear, that should sound familiar, upon the holy evangelists of Almighty God, that we will never divulge, during our natural lives, communicate, or make known to any person or persons in the known world our knowledge or any part thereof respecting William Morgan's intentions, in parentheses, communicated to us, to publish a book on the subject of Freemasonry, neither by writing marking, or insinuations, or any way divisible by man, sworn to and subscribed this 13th day of March 1826, and is signed by John Davids, David C. Miller, and Russell Dyer. John Davids and Russell Dyer are financiers. They're putting up money, but they're not actually printing anything. Miller's doing the work. He's the printer. So we know who these figures are, and that note should sound really familiar to many of you. It does mimic a certain part of Masonic ritual, and it's not surprising that they would do that. We tend to go back on precedent when we're looking for a way to write something new. And it may have been their way of taking a shot at the Masons, even though the Masons, in their mind, would never actually read it. So during that spring, soon after the plan to publish an expose is leaked. Morgan, of course, playing a role as we have seen. He's drunkenly talking about this. So he's one of these people who has alcohol and it loosens him up enough that he goes, yeah, you know what's a good idea? Let's talk about all of this publicly. It's problematic. The drunker he gets, the looser he tends to be with information, and he's boasting about his plans publicly. More than likely, this is almost instantaneously getting out. He's one of those people who just can't keep a secret. And at the end of the day, the Masons learn about it very, very quickly because this is a small town. How long would it have taken for someone to go, hey, by the way, brother whatever, did you hear about this Morgan guy saying this? Or walking up to someone just talking about, hey, there was this guy shooting his mouth off in the pub. It's crazy. He was talking about writing an expose. Not the sort of thing we typically hear in a pub. And that would get out. So by July, around about July 25th, Miller bails Morgan out of jail over a debt owed to Nathan Follett, probably son to Orland Follett. And this also means Miller is responsible for Morgan staying in the area. That's going to be important later on. Miller, at the same time, is suffering financial losses because a lot of advertisers are pulling out due to their broad knowledge of the upcoming expose. Even if you're not a Mason, you know the Masons have powerful positions within the town. Do you really want to go and antagonize them? This doesn't sound like a great idea. So, for this reason, because Miller's down on his luck financially, he must bail Morgan out so Morgan can complete the manuscript on which Miller's fortunes ride. He has no choice. He has to help Morgan out. Now, as we move into August, we see August 5th, Miller, Davids, and Dyer execute a bond for $500,000 payable to Morgan for his book, basically guaranteeing that if he provides them the book, they will publish it. Otherwise, there's this ridiculous penalty. Now, at the time, $500,000, let's add our 40 times multiplier for inflation over the years, and we get something like $20 million. Obviously, these guys don't have that. The point of the bond is more an assurance. It's more symbolic. It's the idea that, yes, we're going to publish it, not that they're actually going to pay Morgan out for that kind of money. People tend to overestimate the importance of that bond, but it is largely symbolic. August 10, Miller receives the following letter from Morgan. Morgan's getting nervous. Quote, "Gentlemen, my note of this morning has not been answered. Further evasion and equivocation I will not submit to. Acknowledge you are not gentlemen, or I will expose you in 12 hours, unless you do as you agreed to. I am not a child. If you suppose I am, you are mistaken. I am a man, and will not suffer myself to be imposed on. You have not acted as gentlemen. I am sorry to be compelled to say it. Every part of your conduct has been mysterious, and why so? My first impressions were that you are not honest men. Therefore, I wish to settle and have no more to do with you. If either of you feel hurt, call on me as gentlemen, and I will give you any satisfaction you wish. Signed, William Morgan." This is a note by someone who feels like Miller, Dyer, and Davids are about to back out. And if you're Miller, this has to have you nervous because you're relying on this book. And you need that manuscript because you don't have Morgan's knowledge. And so to receive this would be in part confounding. What is this? Is this some kind of paranoia? Is there something going on? No one's really sure how to read this because it's out of context, and Miller doesn't talk aloud about it. We don't find any reply to it either, so it's unclear what happens. But that's on August 10th, and on August 14, 4 days later, we see a copyright application for the book being filed. At the same time, or roughly the same time, the Republican Advocate prints an announcement. Quote, "There will be issued from the press in this place, in short time, a work of rare interest to the uninitiated, being an exposition of ancient craft masonry by one who has been a member of the institution for years." So, shortly after that note from Morgan, we have Miller going out and filing a copyright application and putting the first advertisement in the paper that this is coming. Now, keep in mind, he doesn't have the manuscript at this point. So he's taking a gamble, but he's trying to settle Morgan down. At the same time, Miller is going to go ahead and travel. And during these travels, while he's on the Erie Canal on the way back to Batavia, his bags are nearly stolen by a group of Masons, but the captain could not identify the bags on passage on the Erie Canal. The bags are never stolen. They were trying to get at the papers, just like they were with Morgan. Let's use any method necessary to just remove the manuscript. And you can imagine their strategy here. Let's try and get rid of the manuscript, get rid of the problem. And what we're going to do is go, all right, I've got the manuscript. Now you could write it again, but how often are you going to write it before you go, you know what, it's just not worth it? In the day of a typewriter or handwritten note, well, in this case, handwritten note, could you imagine how much time it would take to write a single manuscript, much less write it 3, 4, 5 times over, trying desperately not to have it stolen, that single copy? Yeah, you can imagine that's going to be really problematic, and it's not a bad strategy. So by mid-August, Daniel Johns, a Yorkite Mason, who we will explore more in a future chapter, or future episode, who comes from Canada under questionable pretenses, as we will see, meets with Miller. He offers him $40 and a willingness to guard Miller's press. He presents himself as a disgruntled Mason who is willing to help out in any way that he can to make sure that this work goes to press. He even sleeps with pistols next to his bed in Miller's press room. You can imagine that is a sense of dedication that's going to comfort Miller. Maybe not a good thing, as we'll see. August 26, Miller publishes an editorial commenting on the alleged letter from Governor Clinton authorizing the suppression of Morgan's book, to give you some idea what's happening here. And again, we'll get into this more later, but Governor Clinton is the governor of New York. He's also Grand Master of Masons. And he sends a letter to the lodge basically saying, yes, go and suppress the book. It doesn't go further than that. The letter itself never really appears. We have a lot of hearsay evidence about it. But here's the quote, Miller commenting on this letter in the paper. "Some are excessively foolish as not to hesitate to express their unprincipled and abusive sentiment. That were the lives of those who are engaged in certain work taken by violence, the governor would pardon the murderers." It had gotten out, or at least Miller's getting out the idea. Miller is a publicist after all. His idea is, let's get publicity for the book, for the paper. He's basically saying, hey, these people might be threatening our lives, and the governor is going to pardon them if they do take them. Well, from Miller's perspective, if you're trying to bang up business, this is a heck of a way to do it. Not only are the Masons against us, the government themselves don't want this seen. How many times do you see websites that say, oh, no one wants you to see these secrets, just click this link, on a publicly available website that everyone can see? You've all seen that. It's the same thing. He's banging up business. Now, by September, Miller is suspicious that the Masons are most concerned about recovering any material related to Royal Arch and Knights Templar. Why? Because this material hadn't been yet published. Again, Blue Lodge material had been published by the London Sunday Times in the 1720s, 100 years earlier. It had been published in part in Pritchard's Illustrations of Freemasonry in 1730. Again, 100 years earlier. Boaz and Jenkins, 1762. What is that? 60 years earlier. This is not new information. The Blue Lodge information is out there. If you want to find it, you can. Royal Arch, however, had not gotten out there. Somehow it had remained secretive. And that may be the key to why this whole thing goes from we're going to steal some manuscripts to we may or may not take someone's life. At the same time, we see an angry letter by one Henry Brown, who's a Mason, who decries oathbreakers and pretenders, and it appears in the spirit of the times. Quote, "No man in his sober sense can credit that perjured wench who commences his career by publishing his infamy." Miller publishes an extract from a former Illuminati founder, Baron von Nigg, critical of secret societies. So he's continuing this. He's intentionally poking the bear. Why poke the bear? Because you want a reaction. The bigger the reaction, the better the sales are going to be, because it's going to get people interested. Ooh, what did the Masons want to suppress? Daniel Johns, however, is in the background, and he's informing the lodge of Miller's activities. He's not on Miller's side. The guy who's sleeping in the press, who's showing up mysteriously from Canada, shockingly isn't on Miller's side. He's a Mason. And he tells the lodge that the printing of Morgan's book has begun, which is probably why things are accelerating as we hit September. By September 8th, a crowd gathered and attempted to set fire to David Miller's office and the Republican Advocate. Now, this fire doesn't work out. They attempt it. There's too many people around. They basically chicken out. They leave. Samuel Green, around this time, through several intermediaries, got word to Miller that he and the shop were in danger. No fire is set as word spread that Miller and some of his associates were armed and ready. This according to Defoe. Quote, "No means will be left untried and no trick unresorted to," this is the note from Green, "to gain access to your rooms and papers. Be prepared for all sorts of alarms and guard against the most cunning stratagems." Basically, Green is saying, hey, they're going to try anything. They might try and start a fire so you leave the place so they can run in and grab what they need. They may bring the police. They may bring any number of other situations. Be aware. Keep your mind about you. Now, by September 10th, 2 days later, fire is successfully set to David Miller's office and the Republican Advocate. At the same time, Daniel Johns has mysteriously disappeared. Our Canadian Mason, our spy. The Masons will set fire to the steps leading to the second floor printing office, which is odd. Let's just think about that for a second. So the printing office is on a second floor. It's a wooden building. And Miller lives right next door. It's sort of one building. There's an apartment on the first floor. And they set fire to the steps. Now, there's 1,000 different ways you could set fire to this old wooden building, and you decide to set fire to the steps outside. Either you are chicken, or you don't actually intend to set fire to the building. Why not? Because if you set fire to the building successfully, and the papers are in there, you have no way of confirming what he has, or where the papers are, or what has been destroyed. It is much better to start the fire and get everyone out, and then use it as an excuse somehow to get in and get what you need. So they're not actually, I don't think, and this is me speaking, I don't think they're actually trying to set fire to it. Because if you really wanted to set fire to it, instead of setting fire to the stairs, you would go up and you would throw something through a window. You would spread flammable material across the walls. You would do any number of different things that are readily available to them at the time. Flammable materials are not difficult to come by in the 19th century. So the fire is quickly put out by a bunch of Teamsters who happen to be passing through town, who smell the smoke and run across the street and extinguish the fire. It's about 4 a.m. It's just dumb luck. The Masons really didn't do well here, and it's really luck on Miller's side. We believe the fire was set by one Richard Howard, a Mason, and some brothers who stayed after the previous attempt and ran after the flame was lit and the Teamsters start making noise. People in town murmured that Miller had set the fire and offered suspicious circumstances of the fire and how fast it was doused as proof. Now think about it from their perspective. Miller's been poking the bear, as we've talked about, and now suddenly his press is on fire. It looks a lot like a grab for publicity. At the same time, the fire is doused by a fortunate group of people who are traveling through town? We don't like chaos as humans. We like conspiracy, and the obvious conspiracy here is that, from the town people's perspective, that Miller set the fire. And this may well be a narrative that the Masons are going, yes, absolutely. This is Miller doing it. They probably didn't start it. They may have. But they're definitely agreeing to it because from their perspective, it works on their side. It helps their case. So by September 11th, Miller is out on a walk in the morning. So it's early-ish in the morning. He runs into Nicholas Chesborough and Constable Hayward, having just arrested Morgan. So he's coming across these two Masons and Morgan, who are walking down the street. Morgan tells Miller he's being arrested for stealing some clothes. Miller's worried that Morgan is being taken out of the village, and therefore he will lose his bail money, a big problem for Miller, who doesn't have much to begin with. He says, quote, "You can't take Mr. Morgan. He's on limits, and I am his surety." Miller continues, "If he leaves the village, I will lose my bail money and become liable for his debt." By the way, this is from a publication that is quoting a deposition by Miller later on. So take it with a grain of salt. These are Miller's words. Quote, "I'm the publisher of the Republican Advocate here in the village, and I've signed 2 sureties for this man's debt. You know as well as I do that you cannot take him off the limits." Hayward, as we heard in the last episode, argues this is a state matter, not a civil matter. Quote, "Are you willing to interfere in a state matter, Mr. Miller?" They turn away and walk towards a carriage. Miller pursues, gets between Morgan and the carriage. He's desperate. He doesn't want to lose that bail money and the possibility of the money he would make from the expose that he loses if Morgan isn't there with his manuscript. So he gets in between Morgan and the carriage. Hayward says, "Look, Mr. Miller, if you like, you can meet us at Squire Foster's office in Leroy, where you can enter bail for Morgan's appearance at the Candahiga court, but we cannot do that here." Morgan tells Miller it's fine. He will speak to Mr. Kingsley, the person he borrows the clothes from. Another man, David Donalds, quote, grabs Mr. Miller by his lapels, slams him into the side of the carriage before pushing him out of the way altogether. David Donald seems to have some tie to this. He may be a Mason from out of town who's there for this purpose. Basically, hey, just keep things clear if we need it. So September 12, Morgan is jailed, freed, and disappears into the night. The same day, Miller receives a message from Harris, a silversmith in town, that another attempt would be made to attack his office later that day. We always talk about Morgan's disappearance. No one talks about this next part. And this is from Miller's later testimony. He arms his office with 2 swivels, 20 muskets, and another half-dozen pistols. Miller would have no trouble taking a few of them out if it came to that. Others stood guard out front with clubs, a first line of defense against impending attack. But then we have Jesse French and Roswell Wilcox, who approach Miller's door. Quote, they knock at the door. Quote, "My name is Jesse French, a constable from Leroy. Open up. I have a warrant for the arrest of David C. Miller and John Davids." French pushes into the office. Miller, what is the warrant about? By the way, if you're wondering why didn't they open fire, why didn't they attack? Because this is a constable. This is law enforcement. Yes, he's Masonic, but it's law enforcement. And even today, there's a big line between I'm going to fight those people showing up and oh no, they showed up with the cops. Big difference. So Miller, what is the warrant about? French, it's a criminal process. He grabs Miller by the coat and starts dragging him to the door. This is not modern process. He's just grabbing him. Let's go. A criminal process for what? Continues Miller. Look, Miller, French said, dragging him down the stairs. Wilcox following with John Davids, the financier, in tow. You are under arrest. You cannot speak to anyone, and no one can speak to you. Obviously, before Miranda rights. Treat me fair, said Miller. Treat me fair and I'll go with you. Davids was released by Wilcox due to bail keeping him there when Sheriff Thompson raises the issue. Sheriff Thompson. Sheriff Thompson is a Mason. He isn't interested in the financier, and there is a bail issue. And as we're going to see, the warrant isn't quite what it seems, so you can't really take Davids out. It's going to be a real problem to do so. Miller's marched up the road to Donald's Tavern, followed by Miller's armed followers and another crowd associated with the Masons, and then another crowd of the town folks. It's like a Benny Hill episode, everyone kind of trampsing up to this tavern. When Miller asks about the warrant, he is not allowed to see it. And French leaves for a bit to arrange a carriage, comes back. He says, time to go. Miller demands to know the crime, while French holds his arm, and he says, quote, you'll see soon enough. Miller's put into the open carriage with 8 club-carrying men to see that he stays put and the wagon sets off. Miller learns during this ride, or shortly thereafter, that there are no criminal proceedings. The motivation was that Daniel Johns had sued John Davids for the $40 he had invested. Now Daniel Johns' sudden disappearance before the fire seems to make sense to Miller. To Miller, he didn't just disappear. Now he's part of the conspiracy. The conspiracy that Miller was trying to create when he publicized all of those headlines and editorials and other statements in his paper is real now. And you can imagine Miller going, oh no, I've just created my own enemy. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so Miller suddenly sees Daniel Johns as a Masonic spy. They stop at Stafford and went to the 3rd floor, which had been used as a lodge room. So they're at Prindle's Inn in Stafford. They're going into a lodge room. They're hanging out there for a while. Miller is in a chair in the middle of the room. The lodge room door shoots open, and who but Daniel Johns approaches him, brandishing a sword, according to Miller, rather theatrically. At this point, it becomes clear that there is no lawsuit, and Miller asks where Morgan is. So Miller suddenly sees this theatricality, Daniel Johns coming at them with brandishing this sword, threatening him, and Miller's going, yeah, right, come on, you're not really going to do this. That's a Tyler sword. We all know it's dull. And even if it weren't, seriously, taking life is a big step from where we were. So he suddenly gets some gumption about him. He starts asking where Morgan is. He's informed he's going to the same tribunal Morgan was going to. Some of Miller's friends arrived from Batavia. He had heard some commotion and is relieved at these people coming in. It's an attorney by the name of Theodore Talbot from town, who we'll hear about more in a future episode. And they come rushing in. They found out where Miller's being held, and they show up. And arguably, had the same thing happened for Morgan, things would have been different. But they are happening here for Miller. So after being put into a wagon by French's mob, he sits there for 10 minutes as French and Miller's friend, Talbot, a lawyer, argue back and forth. The legalities, what's going on, why can or can't Miller be taken at this point. At one point, French orders Miller taken back into the lodge. His friends from Batavia counter this and got him back into the open wagon. He was taken by his supporters to a local magistrate, to a judge, accompanied by French and Wilcox, who, when they arrive at the magistrate's place, at Barton's place, Barton is the magistrate, French and Wilcox suddenly disappear. Why? Because there's no case. It's all a ploy to get Miller out of town. The idea was get Miller out of town, try and separate him from Morgan by any means necessary, and then go from there. They weren't counting on a bunch of associates joining Miller and coming after him. That's what throws the whole thing off. Otherwise, no one would have looked. That's why they had to move him from Batavia to Stafford, because they have to play like, hey, there are criminal charges and we're going to go see the judge or a judge. Remember, this is the time of circuit courts. The judges are in different places at different times. They're not necessarily visiting Batavia, at least not at a time that's convenient. So while walking, he's taken by his supporters to the local magistrate and then disappears. And then he's walking to a tavern in town, Hall's Tavern. He's seized again by French, who produces a new warrant. Each time French grabbed him, his friends intervene. This goes back and forth at least 3 times between French and the Masons and Miller and his friends. And Miller's just getting ping-ponged back and forth. No, we've got him. No, we've got him. You got to think that he's got an incredible sense of terror going through his mind, because at this point he knows what could happen to him. It's that self-fulfilling prophecy. And so he's going to do everything he can to win, but he doesn't have all the power. He's one person. We have 2 mobs fighting over one person. Finally, when French grabs him and the friends intervene and we go back and forth, this will be enough that his associates, rather than keeping him in town to go see the local judge, just push him into a wagon, send him to Batavia. And they make sure he gets there. September 18th, 6 days after Morgan's disappearance, and 7 days after the disappearance, 6 days after Miller has been kidnapped, Miller publishes an editorial suggesting Morgan's assassination. Early the next year, March the next year, Miller publishes the first edition of the Morgan Investigator, an anti-Masonic paper, one of the first that will appear in New York and lead to that anti-Masonic party. So we've come to know and follow a man notorious to Masons throughout the U.S., from his first meeting with Morgan through his abduction. However, history is more interesting when you start to look at other perspectives. We've looked at the 2 people who are generally seen as the protagonists of the story, Miller and Morgan. Now I want to look at a couple of other perspectives. In the next episode, we will look at the perspective of Samuel Green in part 4 of The Morgan Affair. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lidke, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.